Spirit monsters are a subtype that, for the most part, have been forgotten. Although arguably, they're perhaps the best off among the subjects covered in this series, as they have seen more effective experimentation than the others. However, like other entries in this series, there doesn't seem to be much of an interest from Konami to actually make something of the mechanic itself in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! The typical spirit monster can't be special summoned. This fact is something that inevitably held them back with how prevalent special summoning became as the game went on. While there are specific spirits that can be special summoned, it seems apparent Konami isn't too interested in changing that restriction, nor addressing it in the long term. As a result, the mechanic has become rather forgettable, seeing as they only have 41 cards to their name. So let's look at the existing cards and work out the potential that they hold. Spirits had a unique interaction with the game when it was back in its fledgling state. The fact they bounced to hand was actually somewhat of a benefit. With how slow the game was at the time, it effectively meant spirit monsters were safe from most forms of removal, namely battle. This was especially prevalent with a card like Tsukuyomi, being able to set a monster. This way you could run over an opponent's monster, and while Otahime also provided this utility without setting, Tsukuyomi could also potentially reset a monster of your own, creating a way to recycle flip effects. Then, when it returns to hand, you can do it again next turn. Ashura Priest was another decent spirit monster contextual to the time it was printed. Being able to attack all monsters your opponent controls was pretty useful when you consider the namesake of Goat was a prevalent card at the time. Being a card that could easily counter it gave it an appreciated niche. Of course, there's the infamous Yatagarasu. The fact it returned to hand was the icing on the cake. If it stayed on field, there was still the chance your opponent had a way to remove it, but because it returned to hand, as long as you were able to maintain tempo, you were ensuring this was not a fair fight. Or they could just delinquent duo it out of your hand, because this game was always good. Or they could hit you with Feng Zheng Mirror. The point is, with the game being much slower, the inherent design of Spirit wasn't an intrinsic downside, and in fact was plenty strong. Of course, not all of them were great. Maharagi and Inaba White Rabbit, cards you may recognize from Duel Link's NPC decks, aren't very good. At least in White Rabbit's case, you could perform a dumb OTK with it, or chip out lethal damage with it. But Maharagi is just a weird card that lets you look before you draw for turn. Fushino Tori is another stinker, giving you life points equal to the damage it inflicts, with a 1200 attack stat. Spirits also dipped their toes into tribute summonable monsters as well. These seeing far less success though. Given tribute summoning as a whole wasn't seeing much success early in the game's life, I don't know how they expected tributes that bounced themselves were gonna change that fact. But hey, they tried. Dark Dust Spirit is Dark Hole. Feng Huang is Feather Duster. These sound like appealing payoffs for the time, but of course neither of them saw historic success. And well, one of them was printed in Photon Shockwave. Would people summon Feng Huang if it were legal in GOAT? The other one tribute spirit that was from the game's early days wasn't aiming to impress either. Great Long Nose skips your opponent's next battle phase if he inflicts damage. That's it. For a tribute summon that bounces back to your hand, you can skip your opponent's battle phase, assuming you even inflict damage with him. I can't think of any cards that would possibly prevent that from happening at the time. When it comes to the original 2 tribute spirits, it's far worse. Hino Kagutsuchi rips your opponent's hand, and Yamato Dragon draws until you have a hand of 5. The problem is, they're 2 tribute monsters that also require you to inflict damage for those effects to resolve. And since they go back to hand, any interruption at all stops them dead in their tracks. 2 tribute monsters in general weren't worth summoning normally for this same reason. So, not giving them some sort of inherent protection is baffling when they're going to leave the field regardless. For some reason, spirits would almost exclusively revolve around Japanese mythology. They would eventually begin to adapt the mythology behind Izanagi and Izanami to cards. With Izanami and Yamato no Kami being spirits. Yamato no Kami is a level 6 and the first spirit to actually special summon, banishing a spirit from grave for cost. Unfortunately, the actual effect on it isn't very good. Popping a spell trap after battle has never been an impressive effect, and Yamato certainly doesn't change that fact. Izanami lets you add a spirit from grave to hand by discarding a card. Adding back a spirit for a discard isn't particularly good, but at least it's not unusable. Izanagi himself, however, isn't a spirit monster, reflecting the mythology by being a monster that supports spirits, which in actual design prevents them from returning to hand. So, if you want to retain them on field, Izanagi is a no-brainer inclusion. At least, he would be. He requires you banish a spirit from hand to summon him. Currently, there are no spirits that benefit from being banished from hand. As is, these cards are underwhelming, but neat. And well, Izanagi also brings up something I forgot to consider until reading him. There aren't any monsters that support Spirit other than him. Gemini had a sizable portion of non-Gemini monsters that directly supported the mechanic, but Spirit don't have that going for them. And that continues because Spirit, unlike Gemini, doesn't have a lot of general support either. There are the Equips, two that understand their place but aren't very good, Spirit Burner that doesn't understand its place and thinks it's Moon Mirror Shield, and then Mirror of Yata, which serves a similar purpose Supervise did for Geminis. Unfortunately, or fortunately if you really think of it, Mirror is nowhere near as important as Supervise, since sticking spirits isn't crucial to their playability. The non-equips don't fare much better either. Spirit's Invitation bounces your opponent's cards when your spirits bounce, and every standby phase you pay 500 to keep it on the field. Spiritual Energy Settle Machine keeps all spirits on field instead of Mirror, which only would maintain one. However, it also has a maintenance cost to keep up. It really is for the best that Spirit isn't dependent on the outside support like Gemini is, but it still comes across as a sign there's little interest in supporting them as a whole. As I said earlier on in the video, unlike most subjects I've covered, spirits still do see some level of experimentation. It's just very sparse, and a lot of the time not very good. While Kinkabyo is an older spirit monster, its effect makes it endure the test of time. Being able to recur a level 1 from grave made it capable of summoning something like Formula Synchron during the 5Ds era, and of course, once the Zexal era rolled around, rank 1s. Kinkabyo is a card that people constantly clamor about buying out at random points, and it's never really actually worth it. While I wouldn't go so far as to call the card worthless, it is funny that every time it theoretically can take the game by storm, it never does. Speaking of the 5Ds era, Gundari is a spirit born directly from it, being able to bounce itself in a synchro at battles. Between Gundari and Great Longnose, Spirit is packing anti-Tenpai technology. It's a shame it's extremely outdated and not at all functional. At least in the case of Gundari, you could theoretically play him as a side deck card in a deck that doesn't care about its normal, but I'm pretty sure you could think of a million better answers to play than Gundari. Yaksha lets you bounce a back row on summon, an okay enough utility tool, but that isn't really helping Spirit as a whole. It could always still see some play, but it's certainly not a card anyone is chomping at the bit to play. Rasetsu is a vanquished soul in spirit. When you summon him, you can reveal a spirit in hand to bounce an opponent's attack position monster. The fact it needs to be an attack is annoying, but not the end of the world. The real problem is that Rasetsu prevents you from special summoning for the whole turn when you use this effect, just needlessly making it worse than it needs to be. Now, after these string of one-offs with middling to decent effects, we see an initiative start to take shape with Aratama. It lets you search out any spirit monster, which at this juncture isn't that tantalizing, but with time can always become crucial. Not long after the release of Aratama, we then get Nikitama. Nikitama allows you to normal summon an additional spirit. When it goes to grave, you get to draw a card. The issue is the literal text is when, so enjoy missing the timing on that. 10 years later, relatively recently, they would print the third Tama in the lineup in Sakitama. It continues where Nikitama left off, allowing you to conduct another normal by revealing it in hand. These created a mini rank 4 engine. I don't hate it, but it feels like one of those cases where design invalidates the mechanic for the sake of modernity, rather than actually adapting it to modern standards. Although Sakitama does imply the intended use is tributing it for one of the big spirits, with you getting it back if you do as well. So I can't harp on its design too much, just something that has a place in the mechanic, but shouldn't become the standard for every spirit going forward. And now we go back to the landfill to talk about garbage like Amaterasu. It's a card that was released in the Arc 5 era. There's a lot to unpack here. They're a level 9, so they require 2 tributes. Not a good start, but hey, we need to address this issue somehow. Cannot be normal summoned in 2016. This is something I'd expect on a card that was released in 2004. Maybe if we keep reading the card, it'll get better though. If your opponent activates a card or effect that targets this set card, flip this card, then draw a card. If this card is flipped face up, banish all other cards on the field. So what they want you to do is Pendulum Summon, because Sakitama was 10 years off from this. Tribute 2 bodies to tribute set this thing. Then your idiot opponent will simply attack into it and get board wiped. Something they're not going to do. Oh, but it can respond to being targeted while set, because no forms of non-targeting removal exist at this point in the game. By the way, it banishes everything other than itself. Then it has the audacity to still return to your hand. Meaning if you did summon it with Pendulum, you lose your scales and lose it because it's a spirit. While there are certainly other ways to summon it than using Pendulum, I don't think there's any way to not make this god-awful. The fact it's a set monster that can flip itself up as a response is sick, but literally everything else about the card's design fails to execute anything meaningful with its design. The fact it has to be targeted is a massive fundamental issue because it's a 2 tribute set. If you tribute set a card, your opponent knows something is up. The design seems to fail to understand how the game actually functions. Unfortunately, there hasn't been much experimentation with monsters flipping up as a response, but I can't say much else on this card not being replicated as a loss. Konami would then design Shinobirds, an archetype of spirits that have a focus on ritual spirits. With ritual being one of the worst summoning mechanics in the game historically, paired with the functionality of spirits, this truly was a match made in hell. And yet, somehow, surprisingly, they managed to pull it off. Eventually, but even the start wasn't that bad. Quickly, we'll fire through the non-ritual monsters because unfortunately they're not very good. They'd be cursed with these 3 stooges. Crow lets you discard a spirit to copy its stats for battle specifically, Pigeon bounces another spirit on field, and Crane lets you draw a card if you summon a spirit while it's on field. Keep in mind, none of these other idiots provide an additional normal or special themselves. This once per turn draw 1 is doing nothing. And when you consider Nikitama requires you summon it first, this idiot really does nothing. Power Spot buffs all spirit monsters by 500 attack and defense, and if a wind monster bounces, you can search any ritual spell or spirit monster. The issue is that Pigeon is the only way to bounce sooner rather than later to make use of the search effect, so Power Spot ends up being more of a sore spot for the deck, at least as it is now. Shinobird's Salvation, ironically, is perhaps one of their worst cards, if not the worst. When a spirit bounces, you can pop a card. It also lets you negate an attack by banishing a spirit from grave as cost. This is on a trap card. You need to set this thing, then wait till the end phase to pop a card. While Pigeon does let you pop a card before the end phase, that's only on your turn. This is a trap card. This card is not only just a fundamentally worse version of the boss rituals, but also spends your precious graveyard resource for a single attack negate. Also, both effects are once per turn. This card is abysmal. It is a win more card that will certainly see you winning less. The premier rituals Shinobaron and Shinobaroness function similarly to one another as powerful removal tools. Baron bounces 3 monsters your opponent controls without targeting, whereas Baroness shuffles 3 back row back into the deck without targeting. Then, after they perform their removal effects, they can cheat out a spirit, with Baron summoning from hand and Baroness summoning from the deck. Then, when they bounce, they generate 2 tokens that could theoretically be used to resummon them. But let's not kid ourselves, that isn't happening yet. Shinobird Calling, the ritual spell used to summon them, allows you to ritual summon them like any other ritual spell does, but with an added benefit. You can banish spirit monsters engraved to facilitate the ritual summon. This is huge for card value, and it certainly feels like mandatory design for a ritual archetype like this. The only issue, as will continue to become apparent, is that there aren't enough good spirits in the game to truly make use of this design. The Shinobird rituals, while interesting, presented another way for the mechanic's design to feel solely like a flaw. Rituals, a mechanic that is already extremely costly in card value that you lose at the end phase, with their offset being that they generate tokens you can use for another ritual. But this is at the end of your turn. Yeah, so it turns out this wasn't the best design for ritual spirits. On the one hand, they were extremely strong forms of removal, and getting them back to hand to resummon and utilize again is good in principle. It harkens back to the original utility of the mechanic. But on rituals, this is extremely costly, and the token generation doesn't really insulate how resource intensive they are like Konami seemed to think it would. However, 6 years later, they would receive support intermittently interspersed up until recently, gaining the mini version treatment that Demise and Ruin got. These cards actually help boost the deck's consistency as well as make combos feasible for the deck. Both special summon themselves on your opponent's turn if they get banished, synergizing with the ritual spell's ability to banish materials from grave. Baron Shade lets you trip them off to search a spirit in a ritual spell. Baroness Shade adds a spell trap that mentions spirits. One annoyance with their design is, while you can cheat them out with the big rituals, it's not ideal. They can't use their effects since they are only on ritual summon, add to the fact they aren't treated as being properly summoned, so they can't revive once they leave the field, which leads to the funny game interaction where their effects are mandatory to trigger, but they won't resolve by design, leaving their only value in that case as them bouncing to hand at end phase to trigger the various Shinobird related support cards. The other crucial card added to the deck strategy would be its field spell, Stars Align Above the Shrine. It lets you ritual summon from deck by using Shinobird tokens or spirit monsters on field, which you can then banish from grave with calling for another ritual. The tokens make sense to be included logically, but don't really check out in principle. There aren't any new cards that generate Shinobird tokens, so this implies you summon tokens off a ritual, then not only do you survive a turn, but a token and the field spell does. Shrine lets you ritual summon any wind ritual from the deck, by the way. Of course, before you go thinking something interesting is going to happen, there are only 8 of those in the game, with 4 of them being the cards you're meant to summon with it, and 2 of them being unplayable garbage. You could try to use Nephthys rituals with the deck, but of course the overall synergy between the two is iffy. Their Link to literally lets you search Calling and Baron or Baroness, which is great. They're really insane together when you open the right hand. I kicked a man's teeth in with Shinobird Nephthys, but it did require me to draw a Nephthys, Shrine, and a Spirit. The stars really do have to align above the Shrine, which is where we get into the issue with Shrine. The card is absolutely crucial to the deck's functionality. While you can search it in archetype, that's with Baroness Shade, so it's not exactly easy to fetch. And when a deck is dependent on their field spell, you can kind of see a game loss coming from a mile away. The fact it requires spirits on field as its materials also serves as a disappointing reminder. The number of good spirit monsters you'll be summoning is near 0. Provided Konami would just print more halfway decent spirit monsters, this issue is at least easy to alleviate, but as of now, hampers the potency of the card. Shrine's secondary effect performs another important role for the deck that makes the dependency issue even worse. When a wind monster bounces, you can use one of 2 effects twice per turn. Add back a spirit or ritual from grave or banishment, or set a Milky Way from the deck. Since you're ritual summoning the Shade Peacocks with Calling as well, you will burn through your ritual spells quickly. Shrine does let you add back one of your callings or potentially material that it banished. Now that the card mentions it, we should talk about Milky Way, which was released a year before Shrine and the Shade Peacocks. You can reveal a ritual in hand, then search a ritual with the same level from deck. It's literally making the stars align with levels, and I love that. You can then banish it from grave to discard a ritual spell and apply its effect. This allows for you to actually ritual summon Baron or Baroness on your opponent's turn as an interruption, which is a phenomenal way to adapt their playstyle. Before, they could only really function as a dumb blind second strategy, but now they can actually interact going first. Seeing as their effects are powerful, if their interruption is strong enough to end out the turn, the tokens generated at the end phase actually will get use. On first read, this card reads as the true salvation of the deck, but doesn't seem good enough. Kind of bad to an extent, since it does require you hold calling, which you can't really afford to do, unless you have Shrine recurring it. And when you need Shrine to set both this card and fetch back the ritual to facilitate it, the load-bearing design on Shrine is only getting more concerning. However, should you read it through again, it will eventually click. Ask not what the Milky Way can do for your archetype. Ask what your archetype can do for the Milky Way. Shinobird Power Spot, Baron Shade, and just about any card that can search any field spell opens up Pandora's box when you can set Milky Way off of Shrine, being capable of searching any level 4 or 8 ritual in the game. You can search a Mitsurugi ritual, because they're also 8s, then you can use the ritual spell on your opponent's turn, sending reptile spirits from deck to grave to facilitate material for calling. Except you can't do that. There are 0 spirit reptiles in the game. While you can just play any old reptiles for material, the fact there are none prevents the synergy from being as clean as it could be. Fittingly, the Stars Align cards really do make the stars aligned with other cards, making the deck almost into a ritual toolbox. Yet, ironically, the stars don't quite align when it comes to the existing Spirit and Wind ritual card pools, leaving me kicking the air in frustration that all of the interesting paths you could take in deck building are ultimately limited simply because care for the card pool is limited. In a poetic way, it's inspiring that an archetype that clearly depicts a struggle against fate is structured the same way mechanically. Being a ritual spirit deck, 2 mechanics that by themselves struggle to function, and together sound like a recipe for disaster, and yet this archetype manages to prove there's so much potential for them. Oh, right, this is a spirit video, not a Shinobird video. Well, you see, that's another issue with modern Spirit. Over the course of the 25 plus years this game has existed, they've only bothered to create one dedicated archetype that revolves around Spirit. At least Gemini had 1 and 2 halves. The closest it gets is the old spirits based on Japanese mythology, but they clearly don't have much design cohesion either. Yeah, so anyways, they printed a Mono Iwado not long after the original Shinobird cards. Yeah, I don't think I really need to explain why a one-sided skill drain you can cheat out isn't good game design. Just ban this card so we never have to deal with it. And design more spirits that actually do something interesting. An underappreciated modern entry in Spirit Monsters was the Pendulum Spirits. Not only did they offer generic scale 9s with no real restrictions, they integrated Spirit's signature bounce while being scaled. Upon using them to pendulum summon, they bounce. They're all level 5s with Monarch stat lines for some reason, and while they can be pendulum summoned, they want you to normal summon them for their effects. Their effects are column based, which have a tendency to be bad. In this case, they kinda are. Sumo and Karate can use your pen columns to out cards. Hanshi Kyudo, which was printed 4 years after the others, bounces all your cards in the pen columns, then lets you search a monster with the Monarch stat line. It can also search Urgula. Is this the spicy tech that makes Dragon Tail more consistent? Probably not. Since it bounces your cards, naturally you don't want to have cards in those columns yourself for his summon. Ideally, he bounces your other scale only. That way you can save it from being outed, word on field, to use again next turn. Or set it again if need be. You can also potentially summon the bounce scale to combo with. It's neat if nothing else. Kendo is the only one to use a single column. Considering the fact all of the removal is sending and not destruction, they have strong utility, but unless people are playing their most crucial cards in the pen columns, they're not really doing much. There needs to be more going on for Spirit Pendulum to take off. Doesn't help that there's not really a cohesive way to play them as a strategy. Is Monarch Pendulum a thing? As of now, Spirit Pendulum is only a neat premise, not really a functional tool. Both the Shinobirds and Spirit Pendulums highlight a unique distinction though. These cards can be special summoned by design, unlike the standard spirit monsters. Obviously, you can't normal summon a ritual or a pendulum in the extra deck, so I like this idea of affording extra deck and ritual spirits this transcendent state that is special summoning. But there are no actual extra deck spirits. Since Pendulum starts in the main deck, it doesn't really count. I don't know if Konami just refuses to print them, hasn't thought of it, or there's some rule where they can't be, but Hebo can turn an extra deck monster into a spirit, so surely it's possible. I forgot to talk about Hebo. He's the best spirit monster, that's all that really needs to be said. The biggest issue is that extra deck spirits are much more difficult to justify in design, as they're a massive investment for a card you're going to lose at end phase. But Shinobirds proved you could still make that design work, so I have to assume it is because they can't for some reason or other. Konohana Sakia is an oddball that falls into a similar category. She can be special summoned. Shinobird Crane Draw, yeah! However, she can only be special summoned, with you needing to control another spirit to do so. My god, they've invented extenders. And, as an extender, she has a grave effect, acknowledging the fact you're not intending to let her return to the hand. Unfortunately though, this grave effect isn't all that great. It lets you shut off a spirit bounce, being a spirit negate at the end phase when it would normally proc. The issue is, you've likely gotten rid of the other spirit you used to summon her. She's certainly not bad on a fundamental level, the mechanic itself is just missing a few screws to make good use of her. Sumuha Kutsunagi, the Lord of Swords, is the fourth 2-tribute spirit monster printed, and while he certainly outclasses the other three, he isn't any more playable for it. While he can be summoned off one tribute, his actual effect is bizarre. Your opponent sends any number of cards from their field to grave, then both players draw that many. Then everything on field, in grave, and banishment gets shoveled back into the deck at end phase. They can just choose to send 0 cards, by the way, so he doesn't even do anything to address an existing board state. Kutsunagi is god-awful. His effect also applies to you, and since it's at the end phase, you are left entirely defenseless to your opponent on their next turn. It is more likely you lose from him than you ever win off it. Sadly, this is the latest Spirit has to offer us, and it certainly isn't impressive. Ascend is an archetype that by all accounts should have been entirely spirit-based on lore alone. It was a prime opportunity to experiment with spirits again, yet they didn't, proving that nothing creative is going on in Konami's minds when it comes to working with this mechanic. Making them spirits would have made them unplayable! They're unplayable without being spirits. What does that really tell you? Before we really dive into what the future of design should look like for Spirit, we have to talk about something that feeds into it. Sacred Spirit is an Ice Barrier Spirit monster. The deck that originally struggled to summon more than one guy wanted you to play a Spirit monster. At least he's not that bad, on first read. If you control another Ice Barrier, instead of bouncing himself at the end phase, he bounces an opponent's monster. But, as stated, getting bodies on board isn't that easy, and with the only real payoff of Sacred Spirit being an end phase bounce, he isn't worth the effort. And when you consider the fact he has to stay on board for the bounce to resolve, just run Hebo. Lancia can't barf this idiot out either. Evidently, it wasn't even worth the effort to print ignoring summoning conditions on it to even entertain summoning Spirit off of it, which is one of the biggest issues with these random archetypal spirits. If the archetype's playstyle doesn't really complement Spirit as a mechanic, or outright ignores the conflicting design, they're just gonna seem out of place and intrusive, which is where we get into the two Gishki spirit monsters. Natalia, when summoned, lets you cycle back a Gishki from grave, but by putting it on top of your deck. This deck does have a divination gimmick with cards like Avance, Chain, and Diviner, but it also has Marker, which is just better, and Marker isn't even good! Amelia, the other spirit included in the archetype, isn't much better, honestly. When summoned, she negates all face-up traps. That's it, and it's only until the end phase. So, better make the turn where you normal summoned Gishki Amelia count. Face-up traps aren't very common, so she's rarely going to serve a purpose. And in the scenarios where that is useful, gee, it sure would be a shame if there were a trap card that invalidated her entire existence. These effects are all so bad that the recycling of them feels more like a self-inflicted detriment. The thing is, these cards are just poorly designed in general. It isn't because they're spirits, it's because zero consideration was put into how they'd interact with their deck's existing game plan. They're nothing more than cute summons you perform turn 3 onward, and in a modern context, that's akin to being useless. An archetype worth mentioning in reference to Spirit is Yosenju, considering the fact they function identically to them. Saki and Nikitama function similarly, but lack the full depth that Yosenju highlights. Yosenju is an archetype that is far more interesting than people give it credit for, and that's in part due to them not being given a proper in-archetype payoff. But I'd like to actually point out the nuance of their design, as I believe it's something Spirit can draw from. All the commas provide you the ability to normal summon another Yosen after their own summon. This is obviously used to chain together all of the 4s on field, but also lets you tribute summon for the bigger guys as well. And when you consider Magat lets you summon any Yosen from deck, the act of tributing isn't that far-fetched of an idea, unlike Nikitama and Dokutsunagi. The issue with this design is that there aren't enough commas for this facet of the deck to be 100% consistent. Where the nuance of their design lies is what determines if they bounce back or not. When they're all normal summoned, they bounce back to the hand at end phase. But since the deck has pendulums and wants you to actually pendulum summon, pen summoning them out lets you keep them on your field. But the sad reality is, there isn't much of a reason to leave them on field. They don't have interactive effects, so they will just sit there and do nothing on your opponent's turn. The deck is more concerned with only putting them back to hand to facilitate cards like Sting. Although Secret Move hints at the idea of keeping them on field for benefits, it really isn't enough to justify doing so. You either use them for Xyz or let them bounce back to be reused next turn. And getting to another turn means you're just playing Yosenju as stun. The point is, Spirit can very well apply the same design principle in having ways to special summon, and while not entirely discarding what makes the mechanic unique, allow for it to have more flexibility in the modern day. It's just a matter of printing cards that specifically cheat them out since they can't be special summoned by more generic means, making it more of an unintentional future-proofing for potentially broken synergies. Not that I think those even exist. Outside of evaluating Spirit as its own mechanic in the context of a dedicated archetype, this game is massive. There are plenty of non-Spirit focused archetypes in the game that could actually work pretty nicely with competent Spirit monsters, provided there were any worth playing in the first place. When slapping together a random list to test out Shinobird, I built them with Sky Striker. My thought process was, you're playing a ritual deck, so you're playing a million spells that can set up the 3 or more engrave requirement for the Striker spells. And, most importantly, Spirit monsters return to hand at the end phase, meaning they only temporarily clog up your main monster zone. And of course, if you can't wait until the end phase, you can always link them off. And hey, multi-roll lets you safely activate any spell card. That means the billion ritual search spells you have to play can't get negated. Just one fundamental issue though. The tokens and the 4s come back. Oops. While Shinobird itself wasn't exactly the perfect match here, Spirits as a whole still has a niche little overlap with Sky Striker that makes them an interesting toolbox they could use, assuming Konami ever stocks that toolbox with usable equipment. Psyframe is another archetype that has potential to work with Spirits, as they don't want monsters on your field to use their effects. You hand trap with one of them, synchro by having the field spell, which then interacts with your opponent before banishing itself to allow you to use another Psyframe effect. Then they come back during standby. Spirits could absolutely do something for them, but just like Striker, it's not super compelling and requires there to actually be something worthwhile to summon. I mentioned it earlier, but Shinobird meets Tsurugi feels like a match made in heaven, provided we ever get spirit reptiles. In this game, there are so many different factors to a card that can make or break an entire synergy with other cards. When you consider Calling's ability to use spirits from grave, there are a lot of different potential builds with other ritual archetypes, but to really smooth out the synergy, you'd likely need to bring in spirits of the same monster type. When you look at the sheer lack of depth of the spirit card pool, you see how much deck building is limited purely from how minuscule the pool is, not even a matter of lacking power level. The deck is relatively capable of making rank 4s, and there are plenty of rank 4s that search monsters of a specific typing. Dempsey, Gigantex, and King of the Pharaoh Imps search types that simply don't have spirits. Gallant Granite can search a card to help them, but it's Maharagi, which isn't helping, or Amano Iwado, which isn't helping their reputation. The depth of the pool severely limits how much mileage you can get out of them. Vanquish Soul is a deck that, in principle, would love to work with Spirit. It has some logistical issues in the fact you'd be using a normal summon on a Spirit, but still, the idea that they return to hand is a genuine benefit for the archetype's playstyle. So, the archetype itself could very well seamlessly include spirits in its own roster. But since Konami isn't experimental with their design, or even perceptive of the majority of the game's mechanics that they could be using, that just isn't happening. And just like everything before, when you look for ways to utilize the existing pool with Vanquish Soul, you're going to end up disappointed. Aratama is a search of any attribute if you really think about it though. Another archetype that's existing design could greatly benefit from the inclusion of Spirit is Flu. They could even base the spirits on extinct birds, encountering the spirits of these forgotten birds on their journey. The archetype lacks 1 tribute monsters, and with its constant resource loop with the little birds, having 1 tribute spirits not only works in their deck, but is actively good. Since they also want to recycle their summon effects for the small birds, this same principle could very well apply to Spirit Flu cards. And if they wanted, they could make a 2 or even 3 tribute spirit that eats up more of your resources for a bigger payoff. By extent, as virtue of how they're designed similarly, Monarch can also utilize tribute summon spirits pretty well. They all have on-summon effects, so carrying that same focus on recycling summon effects checks out. Hell, Ether summons a Monarch from deck at the cost of functionally turning it into a spirit, so it's not that out of place to include in future design for them. They designed support for this archetype while I was writing the script. We'll get them next time. Divine Wind of the Mist Valley Exactly is a card with potential in the context of spirits. It's just that the one wind-focused spirit deck has a widely better field spell to be playing. There's also the fact that I don't think there's anything worthwhile to summon during your end phase. The takeaway is, any card like it that triggers when bounces happens always has strong potential with Spirit. Spirit Pendulums can always expand on the hybrid in many ways beyond just bouncing from scale after a pen summon. Since Konami's terrified of the mere concept of pendulum summoning a Blue Eyes or Karibo, they could design level 1 pendulums as well as 8 or highers to return to hand from the extra at the end of the turn. Other than the high-level ones being difficult to summon in general, they are near impossible to recur, so designing cards that actually allow you to do so greatly helps the functionality of them. Of course, there are existing pendulums with this issue, and they can't very well patch this in on all of them, but they very well could also design Spirit Pendulums that bounce your whole face-up extra deck to hand at the end phase. This gives Pendulum back its comeback style for Master Rule 3 without adding fuel to the fire that is Pendulum's combo slop issue, an issue Konami continues to create, by the way. The existing martial arts Spirit Pendulums are mostly high scales and have Monarch stat lines. They could go the whole 9 yards and make a bunch of low scales and 1 high scale with the Squire stat line. And if they really want Pen Monarch to be a thing, the Squire Pens could be the type of Spirit Pendulum I mentioned earlier, returning to hand from the extra at the end phase to be used again. Although that would have a disgusting relationship with this card. And well, I'd honestly prefer it get banned and they pivot design a bit. But that's asking Konami to put care into their design, a foreign concept for them. The last bit I have to say about Pendulum Spirit is more so to do with Abyss Actor specifically. Spirit is a monster type that has been used for thematics and to varying degrees of success. I've already mentioned many ways for Pendulum to uniquely utilize its functionality in a way only Pendulum can. The reason I singled out Abyss actors is because they have both issues with high and low levels not lining up with scales. Mellow Madonna is Mellow Madonna, so the low scale issue kind of remains. And while Twinkle is a scale 9, she's not a particularly good one. Considering the archetype's basis in theatrics, it would be more than fitting to design a spirit based on the Phantom of the Opera, or a card in the vein of all the performances that historically get people killed, using spirit as a way to help the deck while also having its unique flavoring. Now we move on to the matter of extra deck spirits. As I mentioned earlier, they don't exist, and we don't really have a concrete reason as to why. So let's operate under the assumption they are possible and work out ways to make use of them. But before that, there's always the tried and true design option to consult, and that's printing a Link 1. Shinobird would really appreciate a Link 1 that searches the field spell, given it's pivotal to the deck's functionality, but that by itself isn't very interesting. It could target a monster in grave, presumably the monster linked off for it, add a ritual from deck with the same level, and a Stars Align card. That way it isn't just searching the field spell. It's interacting with the material that made it, and using it as a means to get to one of the Shade Peacocks, then allowing you to grab Shrine, Milky Way, or any potential future Stars Align cards. And if you get an 8 engrave before the search, it can fetch Baron or Baroness. A Link 1 with a more generic application for Spirit could be one that specials a Spirit from deck, then provides an additional Spirit normal summon. I think this would be the real last piece of additional normal summon support Spirit needs. Spirit as a whole doesn't have to convert to just being worse flu, but giving an accessible card like this helps them actually get off their feet. The only issue is that it's a Link 1 that functionally gives you 3 bodies. One of the obvious restrictions to apply would be just not let the Link 1 be used as Link material, but it could be an excuse to design extra deck spirits, locking you into them. Let's go in order of their implementation in the game, starting with Fusion. Neospatians functionally are spirits, and they're not exactly good. While them returning to extra deck at the end phase isn't the sole reason for that fact, it certainly doesn't help their case. The 2 newest fusions opted to turn the fact they returned to extra deck into a benefit. While I appreciate that on a conceptual level, the execution very clearly isn't sound. You know the neat thing about returning to the extra deck? It's not returning to the hand. You know what card type can make physical contact with cards returning to the extra? This contact could trigger summoning out a different monster and negating its effect that would shuffle it back into the extra. While I don't think this could be exclusive to fusion spirits, I mention it because of the contact fusion. Also, Crystal Beast got pendulums, so it's not that out of place. Just a bit late. Of course, an entire card type shouldn't be reliant on another one to salvage them. So, on a wider level, you'd want the return of spirit fusions to mean something other than, oh. Konami is constantly bending the rules of how card types function, so it's not like there needs to be a constant throughout every card with the text Spirit on them. If they wanted a uniform design for every extra deck spirit, it could just be they bounce their materials to hand in order to stay on field. However, they don't necessarily need to be uniform in design either. Every extra deck mechanic spirit could function differently. Fusion spirits could go to grave to turn back into their materials, but be capable of resummoning on your opponent's turn by bouncing the materials as an interaction. Shiranui give a perfect segue into synchro spirits banishing themselves instead. Shiranui really could have used spirit thematically, and it feels criminal they didn't. If they had spirit synchros that banished at the end phase, that could lean into the deck's existing playstyle, and just like with the fusion example, bouncing its materials to resummon itself. In the case of Shiranui, you'd want it to either cycle back other banished Shiranuis to grave to recycle your resources for its resummon, or banish more from grave to resummon it, with this method triggering more of your banish effects. Could go either way, or just have a synchro for each. It would also help with the fact that Spectral Sword kind of sucks and can only use its effect the turn after it's been sent to grave. A Spirit Xyz is perhaps the easiest solve of all time. It has Xyz material. They could just be designed to detach them as a maintenance cost to prevent bouncing. Or if you were to follow a similar design principle as the other two, they could return without materials and have that be the unique gimmick of Spirit Xyz, being better without materials attached to them, tying in with Spirit's loose connection with the physical world. Lastly, we have links. While I already suggested links that support spirit, those themselves don't necessarily need to be spirits themselves. So the question as to what a link spirit would be is what we have to interrogate. I think the most interesting thing link spirits could do is move to the main monster zone, or bounce if it's already in the main monster zone, with a focus on them giving benefits to the monsters that they point to. They could be explicitly designed with bad arrows for the EMZ as they're intended to be moved elsewhere. The only issue with them is that you can't utilize more than one Spirit Link a turn. Spirit Links could also bounce cards they point to instead of themselves at the end phase, making certain arrows delayed removal against your opponent, and others a means of bouncing your own monsters. And while bouncing your own cards has a history of degeneracy, it being an end phase resolution helps limit just how degenerate it can get. The possibilities with each extra deck mechanic are limitless. Spirit cards are far from being beyond salvation. They're just an arm's length away from playability. Konami only need to reach out to hold their full potential in their grasp. I can only hope the stars align one day so that we finally get to see that potential realized.